Hello, everyone. My name is Frédéric Desbiens, and I'm a program manager at the Eclipse Foundation for IoT and Edge Computing. And it's my pleasure today to welcome you to this session. So essentially, this talk is about, well, not only Eclipse tools, but generally speaking about development tools and specifically IDEs. And the important component there is to remember that RISC-V and Core-V specifically is a fantastic platform, but without the proper tools, you are creating barriers to adoption. So the whole point of this talk is to think together about how can we build tools and specifically IDEs that will facilitate adoption of Core-V. And as I was preparing this this presentation, I was trying to think to myself, how can I explain this in a way that will make sense for everyone? And the answer that came to me is beer. And why beer? It could be wine, it could be chocolate, but essentially, the point here is that openness creates ecosystems. When you think about beer, it's been discovered by accident by ancient Egyptians, thousands of years ago. And after that, it propagated through the world. It literally took the world by storm. And now, when you want to have beer, you have so much choice, from all over the world. And the same can be said about software and about tools. I mean, openness creates ecosystems, and without an ecosystem, you don't have success. It's really as simple as that. And the same could be said about wine and about many other things. But the fact that the industrial process for beer was open from the start and propagated through the world created this incredible ecosystem. And when we look in a wider perspective about software ecosystems and IoT and that kind of stuff, I mean, open source in a software perspective is eating the world right now. In fact, in the 2019 IoT commercial adoption survey, and we run surveys like that at the Eclipse Foundation year after year, we found out that 60% of companies in our 2019 survey are factoring open source in their IoT deployment plans, okay? And it's really important because you need a strong software story as well as open hardware. We believe pretty much at the Eclipse Foundation in open hardware. That's why we have this strong partnership with the Open Hardware Group. And the fact is, the market is agreeing with us. People believe now in the power of open source in the case of software. And now our common task, when you consider the Eclipse Foundation plus Open Hardware Group, is really to make that open hardware plus open software story happen in the market. And when we asked people in that same survey, why are you picking open source technologies? You may think that the number one reason was cost. Well, cost was one of the ones mentioned, but it came at number two. The number one reason that people mentioned was flexibility. The fact that you can tailor your software stack for a specific use case, and expanding that in the hardware realm is especially important, and especially in an IoT perspective, because you don't want to waste cycles, you don't want to waste power for things that you don't need. So by being so open, obviously, the Core-V cores really are the perfect fit for that kind of deployment. And then when you look on the other side of the slide at number 3, people, the third highest mentioned reason why people wanted to adopt open source technologies were more control. But this is more control in a freedom perspective, in the sense, I want to be free to really shape my solution according to my requirements. And so once again, that for that open source story to happen, you need both open source hardware plus open source software, and a strong open source software stack for Core-V is especially important. And to make that happen, you need proper IDEs, proper tooling. So this is why the software task group at Open Hardware is so important. And when you look at what they have on the table, this is really everything that we need, I think, in a program perspective to make that vision of open hardware and open software together happen. So they care about compiler tool chains, and here tool chain is really not just the compiler, but assembler, linker, debugger, libraries, everything that you need, plus obviously work on compatible operating systems, because you don't want really, you know, the bare metal approach maybe will work in some cases, but it's certainly not the most productive one. And we need, you know, Core 5 developers to be productive. Then it's about also processors and platform models. So really, you know, a wider assortment of things, not just the core tooling. IDE is an important part of that, and in the second half of this presentation, Alexander will tell you all about, you know, the plans that we have in store for the Core 5 IDE. Benchmarking is also an important dimension that the software task group is considering, and then demonstration applications. And demo applications, you know, you may think, yeah, demos, that's not, it's not a core concern, but it is, because once again, this is about lowering the barrier to entry. So you need great demo apps that showcase the power of the platform in order for people to be able to learn from that and see the possibilities. And once again, it's fantastic because the software task group has that on their roadmap. Now, the wider goals of the software task groups, there are two of them. And the first one is especially important: to create a thriving commercial ecosystem for Core 5 software tools, and not just tools, but models and OSs as well. And as a second point, to see, you know, in those tools, models, and OSs, the ones that are open source maintained as part of upstream distribution. So this is not about little obscure forks or anything like that, but rather really, you know, to create, once again, this vision of an ecosystem where we work on the open and where we bring transparently to the market great tools and great solutions. So taking a step back, where does the Eclipse Foundation fit versus Open Hardware Group in all of this story? And really, Open Hardware here is about the tool chain and obviously the Core 5 IDE that Alexander will tell you about. But then at the top, there's a wider open source IoT ecosystem and even edge computing, if you consider that for the application core. And that's really important. So we at the Eclipse Foundation are all about software. We don't have the hardware know-how that you have at Open Hardware, but we have working groups, specifically the Eclipse IoT working group and the Eclipse Cloud Development Tools working group, that are focused on bringing onto the table, you know, this wide array of IoT ecosystem components, and then you know, work on integrated development environments as well. And that's not just the traditional Eclipse IDE, but as I mentioned, the cloud dev tools, you know, browser-based development. That's an important concern for us. And that's why we all come together today. And when you consider everything in Open Hardware at Open Hardware Plus, the wide array of open source solutions in Eclipse, and you bring that together, you have an unbeatable combination there. So a few words about what we do at Eclipse IoT. So essentially, Eclipse IoT is a set of building blocks for IoT solutions that are right now used by leading commercial IoT providers. And we pretty much believe in commercial adoption, as is the software task group, right? They want to build a robust ecosystem of commercial tooling for Core 5, and we believe in the same in an IoT perspective at the foundation. And we cover everything from MCUs to edge nodes to cloud in what we have in our toolkit. And right now, what this toolkit is 45 projects, and we have 46 member organizations involved in there. And that membership is really a diverse bunch. So we've got our 3 strategic members, Bosch, Eurotech, and Red Hat. But if you look at the rest of the members, it's really a who's who of, you know, important players in the IoT ecosystem. And an interesting player there being the Linux Foundation. They are a member because we collaborate to make sure that the components that we have and solutions that we've got work well with the Zephyr operating system, which is very popular at this point in time in the Core 5 ecosystem as well. So anyway, I won't bore you to death with all of that, simply to tell you that if your organization is a member of Open Hardware Group, then your organization can, for free, become a member of the Eclipse IoT working group and build, you know, this wider IoT ecosystem with us. because essentially all open hardware members are Eclipse members, and then you just need to sign an additional document and you are in for Eclipse IoT. So that's all I had to say about that. And now let's focus a bit more the Core 5 IDE with Alexander.
Thanks, Frederick. Yes, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Alexander. I'm leading a small company registered in St. Petersburg, Russia, where we have a lot of IT centers. We are consulting regarding Eclipse technologies and IDEs. I'm also actively committing to the key Eclipse projects like Eclipse Platform and Eclipse CDT, and I'm leading my own Eclipse PSAS project. For the open hardware, I'm leading IDE effort as software task group. Next, please. So as I have about 20 years of experience of creating IDE and tools, I have something to say regarding it. So you can agree or disagree with me. So what do we expect from IDE? The first thing is configurability, especially important when you are using non-standard tool chains or different architecture and so on and so forth. Extensibility is also important because we all like to add more and more functionality to our IDE, and it can be both open source and commercial extension. Scalability is critical, I would say, for modern system on chips because they can have really huge headers generated from the hardware description. And this is where a lot of IDE just stucks, and we would like to solve that as well. Usability is important because it's regarding our productivity, and agility is, well, honestly, it just looks nice there. But it's so good to have your IDE agile that works ahead of you. Next slide, please. This is why we started the IDE effort. And we already managed to assemble and create the, let's say, a starter version, or we call it foundation, and it contains sufficient set of things to be tuned on user side and then successfully use its Eclipse modeling framework, Eclipse platform, Eclipse CDT, and Eclipse embedded CDT, also known as GNU MCU ARM plugins. You will see more details on the next slide. So why we are using Eclipse modeling framework? Because when we are talking about configuration, this is about modeling framework. It has really great abilities to describe your model and produce a code from it. It's really underestimated for the embedded development, but widely used in Java world. Next slide, please. And the next core stuff is part of core stuff is Eclipse platform, and it's mostly about extensibility. It has perfect OSGI-based runtime inside. OSGI is a specification for dynamic systems, big one. So it has workspace to manage project metadata. It's very important to say what folder is responsible for what, and natures and builders is also about this, because you can say that my project or my folder contains artifacts of this kind. What do I mean? You may place a linker script in one folder and have one capabilities, and assembly files in another, C and C++ in another folders, and have a dedicated builders to check or to go through toolchain for those. SWT and GFace is two great libraries to create reusable user interface, all that wizards, editors, and so on. And workbench model help you to organize the perspective. For example, if you have a debug perspective, it has different layout from the coding perspective, and this is where workbench plays for us. P2 is to resolve dependencies, especially when you're installing different extension, including to chain, yes. And the next big thing is Eclipse CDT. The Eclipse CDT may, yes, it's the next slide, please. The Eclipse CDT is, may look complex, but it realizes so much functionality that many companies already use it. to support coding for the hardware. And they're really successful because, as I said, CDT realized the incredible amount of function for free. You just need to tune it. Yeah, and the return of investment will be great. You can see through the list how much companies are using it. Next slide, please. And briefly regarding CDT, why it's so different from the from other editors, because you have an ability to precisely set up everything around your project. It includes, but not limited to, the tool chains, different configuration, SDK that you're using, paths for includes, building tools, and really a lot of things. So, and this is just a sample user interface. We already have RISC-V tool chains integrated with Eclipse embedded CDT, and integration of MBCOS tool chain is in progress. Next slide, please. And do we have it? Yes. So after configuring the project, it will upgrade from just editor with highlighting to real IDE, because now it is able to find all your headers, to index all your sources, to provide more capabilities for you, like find definition and find usages and so on and so forth. A lot of services around that. Please, next slide. So it is also important that CDT itself has very rich debug support capabilities. It supports GDB, and it supports a lot of user interface to visualize what you are debugging. So the effort to integrate your own debugger is not so big. Next slide, please. Okay, and what is important also to mention, that Eclipse CDT has ability to integrate a lot of third-party tooling that has let's say command line nature, and it's all can connect through Telnet and SSH. It can visualize the output from local terminals and parse the input and turn it to the errors in your sources or build script, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Another important component is Eclipse embedded CDT. It's well known in embedded developer world because it supports a big number of different architectures, including RISC-V, and it has a lot of templates for different cores. Also, it integrates debugging support that is widely used, and a lot of tool chains of different nature. Next slide, please. And what is important and now is also an Eclipse project in IoT family. And the latest news from this project is that it supported the Raspberry Pi, because Eclipse platform just supported R64 architecture. And here the screenshot, the Eclipse CDT is running on Raspberry Pi 4. Next slide, please. So this is the basic but very important components that we already integrated to our IDE, and the plans what we have and what we can consider is even more components. I should mention the LSP, LSP for E and LSP for J, that provides a language server protocol and debug adapter protocol. I also should mention the platform IO, that is not an IDE itself, but rather a platform that supports different IDE, and also the Eclipse Passage project that opens a way to provide commercial solution, the fine-grained control regarding used functionality. Next slide, please. So a bit more about LSP, so you can read more according to this link. It's a language server protocol that extracts the heavy tasks to another process. And similar is for debug adapter. I will tell a bit later on the slide. Please, next slide. So the LSP for E is integration of VS Code-like capabilities to the Eclipse IDE. It's currently in the incubation state, but it's already really useful, and a lot of language ecosystems using it. And we started to support it in the latest CDT release as well. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with what the debug adapter protocol is, it allows to focus on the, let's say, share the most complex part, implementation, and just have a front end as an IDE and a lot of adapters for particular language. It's very similar with what we have in LLVM architecture, if you're familiar with it. Next slide, please. So for Platform IO, who is not yet familiar with it, I really recommend to have a look because it's support just unbelievable amount of target boards and software frameworks and architectures and operating systems. And the idea of it is to integrate something once and have an ability to use all the luxury of that ecosystem. So it's all about adapters and the common core. So if you integrate some board inside it, you will get access to every debugger supported by the system, for example, and vice versa. Next slide, please. And we are starting to work, my company, RCSOAP, is working with Platform IO to provide the Eclipse integration, and it will be open source as well. So it's a good news for community. Next slide. And finally, a few words about Eclipse Passage. So it allows to control constraint, as I told you. So you can just declare some function as restricted, and after that you can issue the license and let the user use that function. So the function may be like application startup or some particular tool chain that is not free or something else. And it's not about money, so probably you will send a license if user have a good contribution profile in GitHub, why not? Next slide. So, okay, what is our nearest plans? We plan to integrate toolchain from MBCosm. We also want to add more sample projects because it's very important to lower barrier. We would like to provide project templates for different silicons, different IPs, and we are working with Eclipse Foundation to publish binary to be a basis for downstream solutions. And one of downstream solution you will see this afternoon in action from Ashlink. So we are working closely in the open hardware group with our members as well. Okay, next slide. So what is important that you all are welcome to participate, whatever you represent the company or your individual, what you need is very simple steps. You need to create an account on Eclipse.org. You need to electronically sign Eclipse contributor agreement. That's easy. Then you need to specify your GitHub identifier and your Eclipse profile to let the scripts understand who are you from GitHub perspective. And then you just need to fork that repository, and don't forget to add sign it off by footer to commit message. This is a requirement from intellectual policy of Eclipse Foundation. And that's it. From this point, you can contribute. So thank you for the presentation. If you have any questions.
And I think, Alexander, one thing that's important to specify here is that your organization does not need to be a member of the Eclipse Foundation or even Open Hardware to contribute, right? Anyone can submit a PR, a pull request for any change on the IDE or any other project, really, right?
That's true. That's true. It's very important. Thank you for the note, Frederick.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, sorry, Frederick, to jump in on you there. Just looking at the
so it was
chat.
it's the time constraint, so I have a lot to talk about Eclipse CDT, but it may took hours. We don't have so much time.
No, we're good.
As well as open source. Yes, I love it.
Awesome. We're right on time. Thank you, Alexander and Frederick. Just to add to the how do you participate and membership discussion a little bit more, I mentioned this at the top of my talk as well. And as Frederick said, you do not need to be a member of the Eclipse Foundation. You do not need to be a member of Open Hardware Group in order to participate. You can participate as an individual, or obviously your companies can participate as well. Simply by having an Eclipse Foundation account. There's links on the Open Hardware Group site. There's obviously links on the eclipse.org site as well to get there. As Alexander said, you sign off the Eclipse contributor agreement. Make sure you put your GitHub ID in your profile, in the profile of your Eclipse account. And then the scripts on all of our GitHub repos recognize and authenticate you as a contributor when you're submitting a pull request with any changes that you might have. The reason to be a member in Open Hardware Group or the Eclipse Foundation is to help drive the direction of these projects. The membership decides what projects we take on, what the features and functionality will be in those projects, and how those projects will evolve and the content that we curate as part of those projects. So that's why you would want to participate as a corporate member.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Anything else you guys want to add, Frederick or Alexander, before we close up here?
Well, the one thing I would say is that it's really exciting to see all of those things come together. The hard work that the software task group is doing on the GNU toolchain and all the very basic building blocks to get a robust Core 5 platform out. But I was really excited about the idea that there's also work on the Core 5 IDE, and now that we get even potentially cloud development tools and stuff like Eclipse Theia, under the mix, and so we are really expanding our scope there, and it's I think it will be a great success factor for Core 5 as a platform for the future, and I'm certainly looking forward to make that happen in my capacity as the program manager for IoT and Edge at the foundation.
Appreciate your excitement and support. Yeah, as we roll out the Core 5 MCU board that we're going to build with Global Foundries, and as Tim and Brian described from QuickLogic, that's an interesting project, and being able to have the full platform and SDK and development environment and everything together is going to be quite an interesting blending of our respective ecosystems. So that's exciting.